thank Peter DeCaratry for arranging for me to be here. I first met Peter in Brisbane, Australia in 2011 or something. It's great to be with him again. It's wonderful to be with Archbishop Coakley, an old friend, really one of the finest bishops in our country, despite the fact that since he has grown a beard, he looks like he was separated at birth from Sean Connery. Thank you, Captain Ramius. I also want to commend the Archdiocese for lifting up Blessed Stanley Rother before the Church in America, and indeed the Church around the world. Pope Benedict XVI used to say that the most compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity was not arguments, even though he was a world-class theologian. The most compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity was beauty and the saints. And in building that magnificent shrine to Blessed Stanley Rother, you have combined beauty and the saints in a way that I know would have made the late Benedict XVI very happy, and that I'm sure will be an inspiration to the Church in the United States and hopefully around the world for decades and indeed centuries to come. So thank you for doing that. In the first 4.5 weeks of Lent, in its official daily prayer, the Liturgy of the Hours, the Church reads every year most of the book of Exodus. That is in part in order to set up the Paschal Triduum, in which we remember that Jesus the Lord is the new and definitive Passover, who achieves our salvation and makes it possible by his Passover from life to death. But it also strikes me whenever I start this sequence of reading the book of Exodus in the Office of Readings every Lent, as we did actually today, how important the image of the Exodus was for Western civilization as a whole. For the image of the Exodus taught the Western world that history is going somewhere. History has a direction. History is not simply random or cyclical or just one damn thing after another. History is going somewhere. It's one of the foundational ideas in our civilization, and it comes from the biblical experience of the people of Israel in the Exodus. Now, it can sometimes be difficult to discern where history is going. I think we all might have a feeling that that's the case in our country right now. I know many Catholics around the country and the world find it a bit hard to discern the direction of the Church right now. I want to suggest to you this afternoon that is because we are in fact living in a very privileged moment. We are living in one of the 5 great transitional moments in 2,000 years of Christian history. And those transitional moments, like all transitions, are always a bit turbulent. Now, if we are to know where we're going, whether that's to the grocery store or the next state or going abroad, it helps to know where we're coming from. Can't really know where you're going unless you know where you're starting from. So I think it will help us grasp something of the magnitude of this transitional moment in which we are privileged to live if we do a quick review of the other transitional moments in Christian history. So for the next 6 minutes, I'm going to give you an oral experience of what some of you may remember from the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Who remembers that? Remember Mason Williams, Classical Gas, 1,500 images of Western art in 3 minutes? Well, you're going to get 2,000 years of Christian history in 6 minutes here. The first of these transitional moments came very early in the history of the church, when what was then the Jesus movement definitively began to hive off from what became Rabbinic Judaism in about 70 AD, at the time of the First Jewish-Roman War and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And that transition produced what we call today the early church. We will read its early history during the Easter season when the church reads the entire book of the Acts of the Apostles. We read about its trials and tribulations throughout the church year when we read the letters of St. Paul, meant to put out one fire or another around the new churches in the Eastern Mediterranean world. That early church, with its simple proclamation, Jesus is Lord. Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. Converted, historians now estimate, somewhere between a third and a half of the Mediterranean world in 250 years. That's pretty good work. That's pretty good work. So that when the Emperor Constantine finally brings Christianity up from the catacombs, if you will, he's being a smart politician. He's joining the winning side here. That early church then gave birth to, even as it gave way to, what we call patristic Christianity, the Church of the Fathers. The Church of Ambrose and Augustine, Basil the Great, Leo the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregory Nazianzen, Maximus the Confessor, the church in conversation with classical culture, the church that translated Jesus is Lord into creed and doctrine. Every time we recite the Nicene Creed, produced by the First Ecumenical Council in 325, which we do on every Sunday, we're living patristic Christianity. That way of being the church had a pretty good run. It lasted perhaps 500 years toward the end of the first millennium. It gave way to, even as it gave birth to, what we know as medieval Christendom. The closest synthesis that's perhaps ever been created between culture, society, and church, as you see embodied in the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. I mean, you think of Chartres Cathedral, for example. There is church, to be sure, but there is also culture, architecture, art, etc. And there is society. If you look at those amazing, stunning windows in Chartres Cathedral, most of them are sponsored by one of the guilds of the time. Church, society, and culture in a close synthesis. A church of great saints, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Dominic, Francis of Assisi, Catherine of Siena, and so forth and so on. And that way of being Catholic lasted another 500 years or so, till it fractured in the 16th century in the various Protestant reformations. And out of that transition came what we know as Counter-Reformation Catholicism. The church, born particularly from the work of the Council of Trent in the late 16th century, which created the way of being Catholic that everybody in this room, really over 60 years old, or maybe even 50 years old, grew up in. It was a church, too, of great saints, Ignatius of Loyola, the great Carmelite reformers, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila. It was a way of being Catholic characterized by simple catechesis. We could even go through that now. Who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? God made me to know him, love him, and serve him in this world, be happy with him forever in the next, etc., etc. A Catholicism of devotional piety, Catholicism very institutionally centered, a Catholicism that produced what many regard today as the model of diocesan priesthood, St. John Vianney. This is the way of being Catholic that survived the assault of the French Revolution, the various anti-Catholic movements of the 19th century, the Nazis, the communists in Central and Eastern Europe. And when many of us were growing up in it, we learned in those catechism classes that the church had 4 marks, right? Church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, taken from that Nicene Creed. And yet there was an implicit 5th mark of the church. The subtext, if you will, was the church is one, holy, Catholic, apostolic, and immutable. It doesn't change. This is the way things have always been, and this is the way things are always going to be. Well, as I hope I've demonstrated in 7 minutes, not 6, that's just simply not the case. And we are now living in the 5th great transitional moment of Catholic history, the transition from the Church of the Counter-Reformation to what John Paul II called the Church of the New Evangelization. I'll get to its characteristics in just a minute, but I want to suggest to you this afternoon that this transition has been underway for longer than we might think. A lot of people think the church began to change at the time of the Second Vatican Council, about which you can read in the book that's been made available to you today. In fact, the council itself emerged out of a process of change in the church that began just a few years before my grandmother was born. Began in 1878, when at the end of the longest reign in reliably recorded papal history, Pope Pius IX, who had been pope from 1846 to 1878, cardinals got together and said, we're not doing that again. So let's elect an old guy. They elected a guy who was then 4 years younger than I am today, which I hope tells you something about how the definition of old guy has changed. And his name was Gioacchino Vincenzo Luigi Raffaele Pecci, Cardinal Pecci, and he took the regnal name of Leo XIII. And his election marked the beginning of this transition from Counter-Reformation Catholicism to the new evangelization we're living today. Leo's 2 predecessors, Pius IX, whom I just mentioned, and Gregory XVI, had a very simple response to the challenges of the modern world, whether those were intellectual, cultural, political, economic, you name it, Gregory XVI and Pius IX anticipated Nancy Reagan's anti-drug program by saying, just say no. Okay, that was the approach to modernity. Just say no. By the time of the election of Leo XIII, it was clear to him that just saying no was no longer sufficient. He came to the papacy after a kind of 20-year exile as the Bishop of Perugia in Italy, during which time he had created the first Catholic think tank in history to reflect upon how the church might engage the modern world in order to convert the modern world. I'm sure many of you have been to the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, where Leo XIII is buried. He's right to the left of the high altar as you look down the nave of the church. And unlike most papal funerary monuments, tombs, he's not lying on his back with his hands piously folded. He's not kneeling, he's standing. And he's in full papal rig, tiara, and everything. He's got his right foot thrust forward and his right hand in the air like this. You can Google this later today. Look it up. As if he's saying to the modern world, we have something to talk about. We have a proposal to make. What he set in motion over a 25-year pontificate, here they think they're electing an old guy who's not going to last very long, and he proceeds to have the second longest reign in reliably recorded papal history until John Paul II. Over a quarter of a century, Leo XIII set in motion just about every dynamic that we are experiencing in the Catholic Church today. Leo created or helped accelerate modern Catholic intellectual life. He created the modern Catholic study of the Bible. He initiated a new relationship between the Church and science by reopening the Vatican Observatory. He created the Church's modern study of its own history by opening the Vatican archives to qualified historians of any faith or no faith. And he created what we know as Catholic social doctrine, that distinctive way, Catholic way of reflecting on politics, economics, society, and culture that began with the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum and has been taken, I think, most seriously in the world church here in the United States. This Leonine revolution, as several of us have come to call it, reached a critical moment 60 years ago in the Second Vatican Council. Since you have the book on the council, there's no need for me to go into a lot of detail about that, except to note, as I do in the book, that in summoning the council, John the 23rd described its mission, its purpose, in one word: evangelization. In a very famous radio TV address given precisely 1 month before the council opened. In his opening address to the council on October 11th, 1962, the Pope said, "We're not here to reinvent the church. That's not our business. Christ gave us the church. We don't have the authority to reinvent it. We're here to figure out how, in this distinctive modern situation, in which so many people have become not simply pagans, but just irreligious, tone deaf to rumors of angels, incapable of imagining that this reality we experience is englobed within a larger reality that gives here and now meaning. We have to find a way to express the ancient truths of Catholic faith, which do not change. We don't do paradigm shifts. We do development of doctrine, and we learn how to make that Christian proposal, that Christian offer of friendship with the incarnate Son of God in a way that people can hear and be challenged by and engaged by. That's what Vatican II was for. The council was given its authoritative interpretation. This is the third part of the book. Mr. DeCaratry will send you the quiz in a month. Everybody's got their Lenten reading assignment. The council was given its authoritative interpretation by two men of the council. One, a young Polish bishop named Karol Wojtyła, who would become Pope John Paul II. The other, a very young, 34-year-old Bavarian theologian named Joseph Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict XVI. And those two great men summed up the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, I think, with three ideas. First, the Church does not have a mission, as if mission were one of a dozen things we do. The Church is a mission. And everything and everybody in the Church is ordered to mission, to offering to others the great gift that each of us has been given of friendship with the incarnate Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ. That means, point two, everyone is a missionary. When many of us were growing up, missionaries were brave men and women who went to exotic parts of the world, often to die in particularly unpleasant ways, in order to bring the gospel where it hadn't been planted before. And there are still missionaries, thank God, like that in the Church today. But as the Archbishop was indicating in his earlier remarks, each one of us received a missionary vocation at baptism. We each got, if you will, the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. That was not addressed only to a dozen or so people on the east end of nowhere 2,000 years ago. It was addressed to each one of us, and one of the points of Lent, as we now celebrate it in the Church, is to spend a month and a half reflecting on baptism, on that baptismal vocation to be a missionary disciple, so that when we receive the blessing of Easter water at the Easter Vigil or on Easter Sunday morning, and Easter water is, of course, baptismal water, we are renewed in that vocation to be missionary disciples. So the Church is a mission, everyone is a missionary, and finally, everywhere is mission territory. Going back to the good old days, when we had the Holy Childhood Association, who remembers that? Little cardboard boxes, you put $5 in over Lent, and you got to name a pagan baby. I'm not kidding, I still have the certificates of my pagan babies. I have become close friends with a number of African bishops over the course of the last 3 synods. And I am dying to ask each one of them, are you my pagan baby? These guys are all first and second generation Christians. I mean, I must have hit the jackpot somewhere, right? That was mission territory. I sometimes say it's those parts of the world that when they were in National Geographic, the nuns cut some of the pictures out so the 8th grade boys wouldn't get too excited, you know? Everywhere is mission territory. Your kitchen table, your neighborhood association, your business, your life as a consumer, your life as a citizen. It's all mission territory. And as John Paul II insisted in the great encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer, lay people are particularly well equipped and in fact particularly charged with being the church's missionaries in the fields of politics, economics, culture. That's why an association like this is so important. It helps equip you to be those missionary disciples. It helps you to support each other in doing that, because it's not an easy thing these days. It's not an easy thing these days. Sometimes I wish we were actually living in a pagan culture. Pagans at least knew there was something else out there. I mean, they might have had crazy ideas about it. They might have been cruel in their worship of it, but they knew this is not all there is. We're in a totally different situation today, a kind of flattened universe, a flattened human experience. So to invite people into an experience of friendship with the incarnate Son of God is a challenge. And it's important that you support each other in that. This transition in the church's self-understanding from an institution to be maintained to an institution to a communion of disciples whose institutions are launch pads for mission, whether it's a parish or a school or a convent or a hospital or a social services agency or a Catholic Charities office, has come just in time. All of you who are parents and grandparents know that family does not transmit the faith anymore. Ethnicity does not transmit the faith anymore. National inheritance does not transmit the faith anymore. 5 years ago, I was invited to a breakfast with the Cardinal Archbishop of Warsaw and his 4 auxiliaries and the military bishops for Poland. And Cardinal Nitsch said to me, "You know our church, perhaps as well as anyone who is not Polish. What do you see?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be very American declarative rather than Italian subjunctive. And I'm going to give it to you, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, with the bark off. If you don't understand that in 30 years, no one in this country is going to be able to answer the question, why are you Catholic, with the answer, because I'm Polish. If you don't understand that, then Poland is going to look like Italy in the middle of the 21st century. I mean, there'll be this Catholic crust or veneer, but there's going to be nothing underneath that's shaping society, culture, politics, and economics. That's absolutely true here as well. No one in this country is going to, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, be able to answer the question, why are you a Catholic, by saying, well, because my great-grandmother came from Guadalajara, or the Breton country of France, or Bavaria, or Poland, or Lithuania, or wherever. The faith has to be actively proposed. Friendship with the Lord has to be actively offered, and each one of us has to take responsibilities for that. That's a more demanding way of being Catholic than the institutional maintenance Catholicism in which many of us grew up, where you just kept the machinery ticking over and things took care of themselves. But it can also be quite exhilarating. There is really nothing finer in this world than bringing others to meet the Lord Jesus. There's nothing finer. And whether that's within the family or within our professional circles or among our friends, that is the challenge that this moment lays before us. Finally, in terms of many of the concerns that people have about the church's situation today because of the culture or for whatever reason. I have been asking audiences around the country for the last several years now to reflect on the fact that while there are entire libraries of church history, there is only one divinely inspired book of church history. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. We read it during the Easter season every day at Mass. How does the Acts of the Apostles end? It ends with a shipwreck. And the shipwreck becomes the occasion to extend the mission of the church where the gospel had not been heard before. So if we learn to look at all of the wreckage we see around us in that optic, through that image, we're going to find lots of ways to do what St. Paul did, because that image of shipwreck to mission is not just something that happened to St. Paul because of a nasty storm in the Eastern Med 2,000 years ago. That is a permanent image or metaphor for the life of the church at every moment in its history. So, thank you for having this wonderful association. Thanks for having me down. That's where I think things are at, as we used to say in the 60s. And I hope that helps give you a few things to ponder during Lent. Let's pray for each other. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Chuck had something here.
Yes.
We hear a lot of confusing things coming out of Rome right now.
Right.
I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, but maybe what are some of the more hopeful signs you see from your perspective?
I get asked this all the time, and I have two answers to it. First, we have become far too, and I don't know exactly how to put this, there's no really English word for it, pope-ocentric in the church. I mean, the Pope is a very important figure in the Catholic Church. I spent 15 years of my life writing about a great one, and I don't regret a minute of that. But the Pope is not the sum total of the Catholic Church. The Pope is not an oracle. The Pope is not from Delphi. He's the Bishop of Rome. And we've gotten far too obsessed. This has been part of media problem. It's hard to cover 1.3 billion people in every conceivable circumstance in the world. So when there's this one focal point, you can get Rome equals Catholic Church mixed up easily. But the other thing that I say to people is that look at all the good stuff that is happening. Someone asked me the other night at a similar event, I think it was with a Legatus group, well, is there anything good going on in the Catholic Church today? I said, are you kidding me? Let's just look at the United States. We have the best seminaries in the world, indisputably. We have one of the finest episcopates in the world. We have tremendous young priests. We have growing communities of religious women. We have more engaged laity than any church in the developed world. We have terrific Catholic liberal arts colleges. We are living in a golden age of campus ministry in the church in the United States. We are incredibly generous, and that generosity supports an enormous amount of good work, not only for ourselves or our people, but for society as a whole. So yeah, there's actually a lot of good stuff going on in the Catholic Church. So let's stop obsessing about, this, that, or the other thing. Finally, I've also said this to audiences. I believe it's true. This is not sugarcoating because there are obviously problems. the living parts of the Catholic Church wherever you go. Oklahoma City, other vibrant dioceses around the country, the church in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the greatest center of growth of the church in the world. The demographic center of Catholicism is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa by the middle of this century. The living parts of the church in Europe are all the parts of the church that have embraced the authoritative interpretation of Vatican II given by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And the dying parts of the church are the Germany, perfect example, that have tried to make for 50 years the failed project that I call Catholic Light work. Catholic Light does not work. The church of maybe, the church of perhaps, is of no interest to anyone, except some aging Catholics. What is of interest is this notion that I can enter into friendship with the incarnate Son of God and be incorporated into the community of his friends. And if I may stretch the Coca-Cola analogy even farther, Catholic Light leads inevitably to Catholic Zero. Just like Coke Light led to Coke Zero. Now, I unfortunately put that in a book that's been translated into 6 languages, each one of which has completely butchered it. I had thought Coca-Cola was so ubiquitous globally that this would work, but very bad mistake. The living parts of the world church are the parts that have embraced all-in Catholicism. I think that's true everywhere. And that's why whatever rough patch we're in right now, we're going to get out of and get on with the mission. Excuse me. Yes, Father.
Thank you. It seems that sometimes the most serious Catholics are so interested in the skirmishes about liturgy, the skirmishes about doctrine, that it eclipses the universal call to holiness, the universal call to mission. Do you have suggestions for pastors or lay leaders to draw the attention back to the real focus of the Second Vatican Council? And not that the skirmishes aren't important, but they're not shouldn't be our main focus.
Well, there's a great book you can give everybody. Okay, cheesy self-promotion aside. When I summarize the question, people get hung up on liturgy wars, doctrinal disputes. How do we get people refocused on holiness and mission? I think by living it. There's only one way to do that, and that's living it. Now, I will say to the deacons and priests present, and the bishop, that we need to preach this more. We need to do catechetical preaching, particularly in this season, that emphasizes this notion of baptismal mission, mission to holiness, mission to mission, baptismal vocation to holiness, baptismal vocation to mission. That seems to me, we had a 40-year kind of lag in formational catechetical preaching. We need to recover that. We need to help people see the world through a biblical lens. I mean, I've been in the same parish for 40 years, which must qualify me for the Guinness Book of World Records or something. And we have terrific priests. I've had great pastors, great associates. They were all friends. But I've said to them, and I'll say to you, we have too much moral exhortation preaching and not enough biblical preaching. Okay? Why on Ash Wednesday do we, was it Ash Wednesday or was it last Sunday? I can't remember. And I'm losing the thought here, which is called middle age. Help people see the world through biblical lenses. For example, what I just said about the Exodus. We'll be reading about that for the next 6 weeks. I know what it was. Yeah, it was last Sunday. So we have this kind of bizarre, what the heck is this doing in here? This really kind of nasty reading from Leviticus about how to get the lepers out of the way. And then the cure of the leper in Mark's gospel. Well, the reason they're hooked together is that to be a leper in ancient Israel was to be put outside the community, which meant that you could no longer worship. You could no longer be in relationship to God because that was through the community. So when Jesus first touches the leper and then cures him, he restores to him the possibility to be in a right relationship with God. And the reason that story is at the beginning of Mark's gospel, that's like verse 40 of chapter 1, is it's an anticipation of the resurrection. To be a leper was to be dead. To be healed was to be raised. So death to resurrection bookends the Gospel of Mark. I did not hear that Sunday. I heard something about, being nice to people you don't like, and not treating them as lepers or something. We had a brilliant associate in my parish for 20 years. He could never be entrusted with a parish because he couldn't organize a 2-car funeral procession. But he read a lot, and he would use literary references, and he'd sometimes try to demonstrate that he was literate. And one Advent, I forget which cycle we were in, but it was sort of from the end of the book of Isaiah. And he's explaining that this is from Trito-Isaiah. And biblical scholars say, well, there's Isaiah, and there's Deutero-Isaiah, and there's Trito-Isaiah. I said and pulled him aside after a message. I said, Alan, nobody gives a damn whether it's Trito-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, or Proto-Isaiah. Tell them what it means and why it should mean something in their lives. So, I'll put that out there for your meditation. Thank you all.